Hope everybody is doing good, and we're encouraged to socially distance ourselves from each other. And I saw something that said physical distance, but don't socially distance. So, in other words, keep in touch. We have all kinds of means to still do that, still stay in touch. Skype, Zoom, phone calls, FaceTime, text. Stay in touch with people, in this time, and definitely check on your loved ones, old or young. It is a tough time, but the medical field feels this is the best way to flatten the curve, to keep the numbers down on this coronavirus. So hopefully everybody is doing that. And, I know not everybody's in good health, but hopefully everybody's in the best health possibly. So I was talking to my friend Eddie Martinez, or Eddie Transcendent, as he goes by. And we're having an intense conversation about life. And he felt like he had been limiting himself a little bit. Because he was talking, he's being considered for the president of an organization that he's currently a member of. Oh, well, he took the president's job, but when he talked to me, he was being considered for president, and he felt like he was limiting himself and almost self-sabotaging it, because he, just him, he was thinking of himself as president. He got all these people that are members for years, and, so he just felt a little, I don't know if it was nervous, but he felt like he was limiting himself. And he seeked out counseling from a friend, and from that friend, they relayed the grasshopper in the jar experiment to him, and he brought that up when I was talking to him. And it was basically, if you put grasshoppers in a jar and you put the top on, grasshoppers will hop and they'll bang their head at the top of the jar. And then after some time, they will hop, but they'll only hop high enough as to not bang their heads on the top of the jar. And then eventually, some of them will stop hopping at all. And the ones that do hop will not hop higher than the lid of the jar. And even if you remove the jar, they still didn't hop higher than the ceiling that they remember banging their head. And it got me to thinking about, where I grew up at, and my people, poor people, and specifically the Black community, and how the narrative was that, we're lazy, we don't want to work. And if you look at the facts of our financial situation as a whole, we don't have any real wealth across the board on average. And so if you look at the statistics, you would say, maybe the statistics bear out the fact that, we are lazy and we don't want to work hard. Well, that's what the data says. But the truth is that, there's been a top or a lid put on our jar, so to speak. And I felt the best way to demonstrate this is to highlight a little history. And this is not to say that we don't have responsibility to try to get ourselves out of our situations. And none of it includes just forgetting about the past. I hear a lot of that too, You know, that's a long time ago. Slavery was this amount of many years ago. You know, almost like in a tone of get over it. And you know, that I feel like while we can continue to try to get over it, just forgetting about it, um, takes away that empathy factor for people to remember these things, remember historically what has happened to us. You know, just to remind you that there is context to why we're in the situation that we're in. And again, like I said, I'm not saying that we don't bear some responsibility to try to get ourselves out of the situation. And historically, we can start with where our history starts in this country. I know we have more history outside of this country, my ancestors, but let's start where our ancestors' history started in this country, which was slavery. And I found that I found a professor, Edward E. Baptiste. He's a professor at Cornell University, and he has a book called The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Now, Professor Baptiste specializes in the history of 19th century United States. So he knows a little bit about this. And in that book, kind of dispels the myth that there was no real connection from slavery to the growth of the American economy. You know, southern states heavy on slavery, their connection to the North benefiting, and then on to Britain. And during those times, America became the second largest industrial power in the world, with the exportation of cotton and cotton products, et cetera, and all those things. Bottom line is the country got wealthy on the backs of slaves, which means no pay, and with the threat of violence and even worse. And during that slavery time frame, I found a story that may be interesting that could kind of a lid. This will go into what I'm talking about as far as putting that lid on us. There's the Dr. James Marion Sims, who is known as the father of American gynecology. And at one time, he was the president of the American Medical Association. And he's known for, he developed a surgical technique for the repair of, I'm going to mess this up, but it's vesicovaginal fistula. And that's described as a severe complication of obstructed childbirth, which is important to women's reproductive systems. So he did a great thing, and it was groundbreaking at the time. But how he got the procedure perfected is the issue. So good old Dr. Sims used enslaved women to experiment on for his trials. You know, we do the animals now, mice and rats and chickens and all that stuff, depending on what country you're in, and the similarities to, you know, reactions that humans would have. He was using enslaved women. And without anesthesia. Without anesthesia. Without anesthesia. And he didn't even try the procedure on white women until he perfected it on enslaved women. So that includes, you know, cutting people open and leaving wounds open and just monitoring it, cutting and suturing, and all that done without anesthesia. So just think of the effect that had on these women and the community and the stories that they told their children and their children's children, and the fear that was instilled in generations down about what can happen to you. Now you may say like, well, maybe they volunteered. And it was a different time. I love that. It was a different time. So, he was only doing what, it was available to him, but anesthesia was available and he wasn't using it. And part of that was there was this weird myth that, African Americans did not feel pain like other people felt pain. So they felt that it was okay to do these type of things to our men and women. But that's one of those, like I said, lids on the jar where, if you put enough fear in your kids or your husband when you come back from that, or the males in the community when you come back from those trials, and they watch how you get sick, and I'm sure some of the women died, and so that's one of those things where historically if you put it into context what that reverberations across how many people and how many generations. It's a jar. It's a lid on top of a jar. If you get a chance, look up Dr. James Marion Sims. And also there's 3 slave women that are prominent in the studies, and that's, let me find it here, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. Look those 3 names up, and you'll see the stories that I'm talking about. So that was one of the stories about during slavery. Now imagine all the other kind of stories that I'm not even telling. The stories that you pretty much know. Just imagine those stories, how the effect that the brutality of the time, how that reverberated down generation upon generation, and how people were discouraged from reading or even teaching people to read. All right, so that's during slavery. So at one point, 4 million slaves were freed. And 1864, 65, I want to say. 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except for as a punishment to a crime. So you can go free, but if you got caught doing a crime, you can be back in servitude, involuntary servitude. Ironically, what also came around at that time, what prominent in the same year, a lot of the southern states adopted what's known as, the Black Codes. These states had vagrancy laws that stated if you didn't have a job, you could be arrested. You had to have papers to show that you were working. And if they found you wandering, and they asked you for your papers and you didn't have your papers, then you would end up back in jail, forced into unpaid labor, which is, slavery. Also, ironically, around that time, the KKK was formed. So people that were free, that was supposed to be part of getting land and a mule to work the land. Never got that. And you had the KKK, and you had the vagrancy laws. I would say that conspired to put a lid on the jar. What do you think? Also, during that time, then it was segregation. People were segregated, which means certain places you can go, and certain places you couldn't go, and it was designated for that. And if you got caught, going into those certain places, then, we know what could happen to you in those times: lynching and definitely beatings, lynching, killing. So you combine that with the KKK, and you free a bunch of people, and at some point there were communities that did flourish, Black communities that did flourish. But when those different kind of KKK and white supremacist groups came in there and basically burned the towns down, or prevented business from going on, the government did not step in to the fullest extent. There's occasions where they did, but across the board, historically, we know that there was nothing done to stop this, and this went on. So slavery theoretically ended in 1865, and segregation, Jim Crow, all those laws, the segregation laws, lasted for another 100 years, to 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And even then, during that time, 1932, was it 1932? Yeah, from 1932 to 1972, which overlaps those Jim Crow laws, those vagrancy laws, those black codes, if you will, the KKK. The government, a government organization, along with Tuskegee University, commissioned those Tuskegee experiments. Now, these experiments Tuskegee experiments is where Black men were not treated for syphilis. The study was actually called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. And at some point, I want to say in the mid-1940s, so this started in 1932, in the mid-1940s, they had penicillin available, and they knew that it was like the leading treatment. And instead of treating them, man, they just watched them die slowly. So it was numerous men. I want to say the trials were a couple of hundred, maybe 300 to 400. It might have been more that they started to study, but numerous men, 40 wives contracted syphilis, and 19 children. And that's the United States, the Public Health Service. So those are the people that, these are people that are charged with safe water, clean air, those type of things. And they're actively allowing people to suffer. So now you have a mistrust for government organizations. There was always a mistrust anyway, but you have these repeated things going on that have given African Americans the idea that the government is against them legitimately. These are not, ghost stories or not, conspiracy theories. These are things that actually happen. These are history to Americans by the government. Another lid on the jar, right? If you want to delve into other things which includes the Tuskegee study, there's a book called The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans, and that book is by Harriet A. Washington. So there's other things that have been done, whether it's in the name of science or in the name of being a white supremacist or institutionalized racism. Now, I just told you that Tuskegee was from 1932 until 72. This was supposed to be a 6-month study, and it lasted about 40 years, 1972. I was born in 1973, and it only because there was a whistleblower that brought this to light. 1972, that's not that long ago. During those times, there was something called redlining. Now, redlining had to do with mapping out areas that, and the banks only loaning or denying loans to African Americans who may want to live in those areas, and basically herding us like cattle to certain areas. The banks would not, you wouldn't even get a loan. That was, during that period of time, along with the Tuskegee experiments, along with the Jim Crow era segregation. So this was all being done. And although there was some lip service by certain politicians, there really was no meat. They didn't actively, or at least enough, they did not go out with purpose and make sure this stuff wasn't happening and essentially allowing it. If just like we do with kids, or if you're at your job, if your supervisor or your mother or anybody of authority says, hey, if you touch that, you're in trouble, and you touch it and you don't get in trouble, and you touch it and you don't get in trouble, and you touch it and you don't get in trouble, or you do something, or you break a procedure and there's no trouble, or there's no disciplinary action, eventually, people are just not going to listen. And so that's what went on with the redlining. There was no real punishment to where there was meat with it, where people could say, oh, a bank, a loaning agency could say, oh man, you know what? I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get fined. Now, not at that time. But if you really, even if you say, well, that was the 50s and the 60s and the 70s or whatever, I challenge you to go look it up now. Go look up stories now, and you'll see all across the country where different banks continue to deny loans to people of color. You're going to see some banks settling, $1 million discrimination suits. Going to see fines, hundreds of $1 million in fines. So, and that's today. You're going to find those type of things. At least as late as 2018, you're going to find stuff, but even in the 2000s. But 2018 is too close to now. Another lid on the jar. Now, there's some things I didn't even get into. You know, I didn't even go into police brutality over the years. You know, depending on your age group, some age groups had it harder than others, but you know, something as simple as, you know, the way we perceive a German Shepherd, I think is a beautiful looking dog. You might like it. You know, it looks powerful, looks strong, looks like it can protect you, but you know, a freedom fighter of the 50s or the 60s, they have a different perception of a dog. And I'm not talking about freedom fighters with weapons who need dogs. You need a dog. You may need a dog to help you with somebody with a weapon. You might. I'm talking about people that were peacefully protesting, peaceful freedom fighters who got German Shepherds sicked on them and got hosed down, fire hoses. So you ask that person that lived through that time, they may have a different perception of the German Shepherd. You know, they may have a different reaction when they see one, they see somebody with one, or they see the police with one. Even if this police officer just shows up on the scene as a precaution, you know, their memory of that kind of dog might not be what your memory is. Your dog, Fido, playing with him in the yard. And that old man can be walking by and have a flashback of what those dogs used to do to his people. Even if it wasn't him, you could see it on TV. It was there for everybody to see. You know, there might have been some outrage verbally, but the outrage wasn't enough and swift enough for people to come in there and shut it down. So the people of that time, they felt there was only certain places they can go, there's certain things they can do. They felt limited. A lid on top of the jar. There's other things, studies where if you have ethnic sounding names, you're likely not to get a call back. These are studies. You look them up. Look up these things. If you think that I'm just making these things up, you can look them up. These are all things that, like I said, will be considered lids on the jar. And after a while, people get tired of bumping their head, and they don't even jump. Some of the people don't even jump anymore because they already feel like there's a limit to what they can do. Their impact may not be what they potentially could be because they won't even try. So I don't say that to excuse anybody for not, you know, giving effort where it's warranted, because there are a lot of people that are working hard and giving maximum effort, and some of those people still can't get where they want to get to because of limitations. And some of the limitations are in our mind. Some of the limitations have been handed down to us. We learn from our parents, and our parents learn from their parents, and so on and so forth. So if you were told something and that's your only experience, that's all it was. And so you went out in the world and that's what you brought with you. On the flip side of it, let's go back to slavery. If you have somebody, runaway slave, or even if you have after slavery was over, people were lynched, hung, strung up, and almost like in a festive atmosphere with people with their kids. If you have your kids out there and they think that's normal, so what are they going to grow up doing? And what are they going to grow up thinking about those people? You've told them that they're inhuman. You told them that they don't work hard. You told them that they're coming to rape you. You told them that they're going to kill you. You told them that they're going to break the law. You told them that you can't trust them. It's another lid on the jar. And you know, there are things that are still going on today. There's still this mistrust on the part of the community with police and vice versa. And that leads to a lot of these altercations where unfortunately, our people are getting killed. And whatever side you fall on it, if you say, well, he should have did this, he should have did that. The fact of the matter is, if you talk to parents of especially African American males, they're telling their kids, how to behave, and especially, how to interact and how not to get killed, as opposed to, hey, if you didn't do anything wrong, don't worry about it. So again, if you put that in somebody's mind, you put that in the kid's mind, he only thinks he can go so far. If you herd everybody into one area and you segregate them, and you put a sign on a water fountain, whites only, that person that wants that water, he can't go to that. You're limiting him. If you take women and perform procedures on them against their will, you've told them what you think of them. You told them the value. You've given them the value, and their kids have to watch them, and their spouses have to watch them, and their families have to watch them. So you've given that whole community value. You've told them what you think about them. All that trickles down generation to generation. And like I said, some of the stuff I'm saying is not that long ago. Now, with that, all of that being said, I don't deal with limitations when it comes to, what I think my effect can be. But at one point I did. At one point I said, look, I'm from this hood. I'm going to die in this hood. I'm going to live. That was my mindset until I started to get around people, and I started to judge people as people and not saying, okay, this guy's white and here's what they did to my people, and just started to get to know people. This guy's Spanish and they do this and they do that. Once you get to know people, and then when you start to actually talking to people, you get to see like, oh, yeah, we all like to eat with forks. We all go to the same ice cream place. We all shop at the same supermarket. We can drive on the road without just ramming into each other, just looking over and saying, oh, they're not like me, I got to hit them. We can walk past each other. We can hold the doors for each other. So my goal is to push myself. And if I could push somebody else, to look up and see that there's no lid on the jar. Again, I'm not saying that there won't be some limitations or there won't be people along the way that's going to try to limit you, going to try to demean you, going to try to convince you that, hey, you can only do this much, and that's as far as you're going to go. But if those people before us, they believed that and just stopped, where we will be at this point. At this particular time, we still be there. So I don't have a choice but to, look people in the eye when they tell me that I can't do something, especially something that I want to do. I have no choice but to look them in the eye and tell them what I think of them and what I think I'm going to do. I owe it to myself. I owe it to my family. I owe it to the next generation. No lid on the jar.